To put this gospel reading into context, Jesus is challenged to explain what is involved in obeying the greatest commandment. He tells a parable rich in surprises. Those who expect to show pity display hard hearts, while the lowly give and receive unexpected and lavish mercy. The Holy Gospel according to Luke. Just then, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead on the side of the road. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, just passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take him and take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend.' And Jesus said, 'Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?' He said, 'The one who showed him mercy.' And Jesus said to him, 'Go and do likewise.'" The gospel of the Lord. You may be seated. I'd like to begin this Sunday's sermon with a little activity. You'll see this grid up here on the screen, and I invite you to imagine that your house, where you live, is in the middle of that grid. Now I want you to imagine all of the neighbors who live closest to you around you on the perimeter. It may not exactly be a grid, there may be a street in the way or a field, but I want you to try to think of who are the people who live closest to you, the 8 neighbors, and then I want you to start thinking about their names. How many of those 8 boxes of names can you fill? And we get an easy one. So go ahead, take a few moments, just mentally in your head, and count how many names you can think of the neighbors that are around you. And have that number in your head. I can see the gears turning. You have 30 more seconds. All right, raise your hand if you could name at least one neighbor. Good job, everybody. Keep your hand raised if you could name at least 3 neighbors. Keep your hand raised if you could name at least 5 neighbors. Keep your hand raised if you could name at least 7 neighbors. Can we give some snaps to these people? Good job. Thank you. Thank you for participating in the activity. In the book, The Art of Neighboring, the authors say that when Americans typically do this activity, on average, 10% of people can name the names of the 8 neighbors around them. 10%, so way to go, those of you who had your names raised for 7 to 8. 3% of Americans can go a step further and actually fill out relevant information about each of their neighbors. But less than 1% of people know meaningful stories and details of the lives of those people who live around them. So it would seem that the typical American is in good company with this lawyer from our gospel lesson today who is wrestling with the question, who is my neighbor? Of course, the lawyer, also known as a scribe, he's a religious professional and he knows the Hebrew scriptures. He knows the law that says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. But this scribe has an agenda, and he wants to know just how far that command goes. Surely there's a boundary. Surely there's a threshold. Surely there's a limit to this love. Right, Jesus? But Jesus, in classic Jesus style, does not give a direct answer, but instead tells this story, a shocking story about the Good Samaritan, and this bursts through any semblances of limits that might be in place. Of course, we, with our 21st century ears, lose a lot of this shock value from the parable that Jesus tells. We don't necessarily know the background of how much Jews and Samaritans truly reviled each other back then. When Jesus would have told this parable, there would have been a visceral reaction in the gut of the Jewish people who heard this story. Samaritans? Oh, no, 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 no. Jews and Samaritans feared one another. They fought with one another. They accused one another of not being faithful. They othered each other to death. There was mutual contempt, mutual distrust. This would have been the last person that you wanted to be stuck on a desert island with, let alone receive help from. But this is precisely the point that Jesus is trying to make. One New Testament scholar says that it's easier to understand just how scandalous this story truly is when we translate it into our own context. She explains, quote, "We should think of ourselves as the person in the ditch and ask, is there anyone from any group whom we'd rather die than acknowledge they offered help or she showed compassion? Moreover, is there any group whose members might rather die than help us? If so," she says, "then we know how to find the modern equivalent of the Samaritan." End quote. So can you picture for a moment, close your eyes if it's helpful, anyone or any member of any group that you would prefer not to be around, let alone receive help from? Who would that person be? This may not be a difficult exercise to do. In the landscape of political polarization and violence and turmoil in our country, it feels like we may be more divided now than we have in generations. The us and them rhetoric is rampant. The demonization of the other side is commonplace. The middle ground seems to be slipping away at an alarming rate. The fabric of our society is being stretched to the limits. We feel it, we know it. So this call to love your neighbor, no matter who they are, may be increasingly getting more difficult, but that means it is just even more important for us to practice. Especially for us as people of faith. Because as people of faith, we love God by loving our neighbors. All of them, no matter how difficult or challenging that might be. It reminds me of the story of Keisha Thomas. This happened back in the mid-90s, but maybe some of you heard of this. She was 18 years old when the KKK decided to hold a rally in her college town of Ann Arbor, Michigan. So she and hundreds of protesters gathered to say that that white supremacist organization was not welcome in their town. At one point during the event, a man with an SS tattoo and a Confederate flag emblazoned on his t-shirt ended up on the other side of the fence with the protesters against the KKK. And a small group of those protesters started to chase him, and he fell to the ground, and mob mentality took over, and he started to be beaten and kicked by that group. But Keisha Thomas, a college student at the time, and a black woman decided she had to intervene. She threw herself on top of that man that she came to protest, protecting him from the blows and saying to the crowd, "You can't beat goodness into a person." Keisha never heard from that man again. But a little while later, she was in a coffee shop, and a younger man came up to her and thanked her for what she did, saying, "You wouldn't know this, but that man was my father." There was a student photographer who took pictures of this whole thing. You can actually go on Google and still see them from 1996. And when the photographer was talking about that experience, he said, what was truly remarkable for him was who Keisha saved. He said she put herself at physical risk to protect someone who, in my opinion, he said, would not have done the same for her. Who does that? He asked. I'd venture to say it's someone who knows the answer to the question, who is my neighbor? And who loves with Christ's love. This is something that we are called to do as people of faith. We may not all end up using our bodies as a human shield to protect other people, but there are small steps that we can do of great neighborly love, daily opportunities where we can share our faith and live it out through our baptismal callings. Because when we are baptized into Christ, we are baptized into a new way of being and a new way of living the way that Christ lives, loving the way that Christ loves. We become Christ's body in and for the world. Now, Henry will join Christ's body today. We will celebrate with him as he becomes the newest member of the body of Christ. His parents and sponsors will make promises on his behalf, and all of us will also promise to walk alongside him in faith too. He will learn and grow and live out his baptism in many different ways throughout his life. He will claim those promises for himself one day too. Each of you, when you came in, would have gotten a calendar. If you have them, hold them up. Let me see if you have them out there. Ha-ha! This calendar has 40 different ways that we can live out our baptisms, practicing our faith and discipleship every single day. I invite you to take that calendar and put it somewhere where you can see it. If you're joining us online, these files that were handed out today in people's hands are online, posted with our bulletins as well. There's also a handout that describes these 5 promises that Henry's parents will make and sponsors will make as Henry grows in faith. All of us are invited to live into those 5 promises, those 5 gifts. In fact, I have little magnets with those 5 promises that everybody who's here in person will get when you go home to put on your fridge if you would like as well. But these ways are simply tools for us to imitate Christ, to share Christ's great love for all people and all creation. Now, when I met the Smith family this past week, met with them to plan for our baptism, I asked them what their hopes were for baby Henry. And one of the things that they said was that at the end of the day, they hoped that Henry would know how loved he truly was and how special he truly was. God, our heavenly parent, hopes this for all of God's beautiful and beloved children. And that may also be the larger lesson of this gospel today, that God will stop at nothing in God's relentless care for God's people. God will go to endless lengths to reach out to support us and sustain us. God, through the cross of Christ, promises that there is no height or depth, nor nothing in creation that could separate us from God's great love. Nothing we do, nothing we say, God's grace will always be there for us, lifting us up out of the dust, carrying us, comforting us, supporting and sustaining us, nursing us back to wholeness, extending mercy after mercy after mercy, whispering to us in a still, small voice, "Child of God, do you know how loved you are? Do you know how special you are?" And then empowering and equipping us to turn to our neighbors, all members of the human family, to remind them of this promise as well, that we are all beloved neighbors, that we are all beloved children of God. Amen.